Hi, everybody. This is Acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Tuesday, December 17th, and I'm doing a video today called What to Do About Astrology Haters. I'm doing this video because yesterday, in a video that I did on Mercury square to Neptune this week, I mentioned the fact that Mercury square to Neptune can be about the rational defenses that people give to try to explain or defend irrational behavior. Um, Mercury square to Neptune, I also mentioned, is a square that can represent an irrational attempt to explain away mystical phenomenon. So the defenses that people give to say, well, astrology is not real or it's bogus or we shouldn't take it seriously. And in explaining this, I mentioned that I once gave a talk on what to do about astrology haters to a group of professional astrologers. So I got a bunch of emails being like, could you do that talk? And I mentioned that I didn't have a recording of it. Otherwise, I would just post the recording. But could you redo that talk? And I thought, well, that gives me something to do for today, content-wise. That'd be pretty cool. So I revisited the notes from that talk, adjusted some of them, and I'm presenting that for you today. So that's going to be the gist of today's talk. However, before I do that, a few pieces of business and announcement first. So thank you all for donating to my annual Kickstarter. As you know by now, listening to me this time of year, I'm raising money for the last 40 days of the year to support this channel and all the content that I make day in and day out, year round. Not a lot of people know this, but the content that I create begins very early in the morning. I begin every morning getting up in reading, mantra meditation, prayer. About 2.5 to 3 hours at least is just prep for getting ready to prepare the content for today, for whatever the day is. And then I produce the content, edit it, sometimes have to do retakes, distribute it everywhere. So this is, along with doing readings and teaching classes, this is how I make a living and how I sustain my family, and how I create also a lot of, through this fundraiser, through the fundraiser that I do at the end of the year, I also, the money that I generate from this also allows me to not have so much stress and pressure on the programs that I produce, that I'm allowed to do, offer people a lot of scholarships, need-based tuition, etc. So there's a lot of good things that this fundraiser does. And if you haven't donated yet, I would really appreciate your support. We're at 399 backers. So if you donate today, you'll be the 400th backer. It's quite possible that you'd be the lucky number 400. Our goal for this year is to beat last year's record, which was 419 backers. So with 14 days left to go, we're 21 backers away from that number. Now, I want to mention to you that all of my programs are 50% off as a part of this fundraiser. So if you want to come and study in my Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic course, it's a 1-year certification course in Hellenistic astrology. That begins in June. On Sundays at noon Eastern time. There's 30 classes on the year. You can attend them live or participate remotely, follow along with the audio video. There's optional homework, quizzes, bonus material throughout the year, 12 guest lectures in addition to 30 full classes. It's a full-on experience, and we have people come into the classroom. You'll see me give live readings for people and break down how the techniques and theory that we study from ancient astrology are being applied. It's a great program. We have a lot of fun discussion outside of class, a lot of homework exercises for people who need that extra structure. You can communicate with me year-round by email about astrology and what we're learning in class. So I will be doing a promotional video for all 3 of my programs because my horary class and my 1-year or my 2nd-year program all begin in June. June of 2020, all 3 sections are starting up again. And you'll have to wait until June of 2021 to take the 2nd-year course or the horary course again. I will be offering one more year 1 course in November of 2020. So the tuition that you get through my Kickstarter is 50% off right now, which is a really great deal. That's only available till December 31st. So I just like to promote that, especially as we're coming down to the wire here. I try to, raise as much as I can before the deadline and make sure people are aware of the sale. So, and like I said, I'll be doing a promotional video for the horary class. I'll be doing a little lesson in horary and showing you a horary chart I'll probably do that tomorrow. The year 1 class I'll be doing a promotional video for, and the year 2 class as well, so that if you want more information on that in the next few days, I'll have something out so you can take a look. You can also pick up reward readings at the Kickstarter. So you have 14 days left to back me. I really appreciate your support. Like I said, I pour a lot of heart and soul into every day's creative content, and I believe that it makes a big difference. I believe that, you know, if you like my content, I promise you that it comes from the fact that every morning so much goes into producing it. So so that's, and my promise to all of my viewers, readers, etc., is that I keep producing this content and keep pouring the same amount of love into it for you guys. So okay, rant over, spiel over. Let's talk about this issue about what to do about astrology haters. Okay, so let's just say this, a few things generally first. First of all, astrology has been around for thousands of years. It is not unusual, it is not odd, it is not different, in the sense that we actually know that a huge amount of the population within any given calendar year will do any of the following. They will check their horoscope in a magazine. They will read a fortune cookie and take it seriously. They will see a sign or omen in a dream or nature and believe that it has significance spiritually, or that there is messages that are borne out through symbols in everyday experience. We know that a huge amount of people on the planet believe in God, or believe in a spirit realm, believe in a soul. We know that a huge amount of people, including our own Constitution, right? What to speak of, like the founding principle of our country is that all people are created equally. That's a metaphysical statement. That is not, there's nothing about the material world that corroborates that, right? Some people are born with all sorts of impediments and challenges, physically, mentally, emotionally, socioeconomically, or racially, culturally, historically. We're all born in a different place and time, and some of those things are filled with privilege, and some of them are filled with challenges. There's nothing in the material world that says everything is everyone should be treated equally. That is a metaphysical statement, and it comes from it resonates with us because it's true, because we're all spirit souls, right? But my point is that most of the planet, because we are spiritual beings living in a spiritual paradigm, naturally believes in something spiritual to some extent that defies logic, rationale, boundaries, normal like space-time conventions. So it's not, astrology is not weird. Let's just start with that. Astrology is not different in the sense that it greatly defies what people are doing each day of their life, which is looking for significance that goes beyond the literal mundane facts of their experiences, seeking meaning, looking for patterns of meaning, recognizing signs or symbols, again, in nature, in dreams, assuming that there is something called the unconscious, that a soul is real, that something of a higher intelligence is unifying the cosmos, that there is a God or spirits or angels. All of these beliefs are widely held and shared by a huge amount of people. Now, they take a lot of different faces. There's a lot of differences. There's a lot of diversity, but it is not uncommon to believe that there is a higher intelligence, that signs, symbols are present around us and mean something. People are in the closet most of the time about their spiritual fascinations or curiosities or interests, when they may overtly appear as though they don't believe this or that, but there are inconsistencies pouring through the cracks all the time. The person that says that they don't believe in astrology one day, on the next day will say that they had an intuition, or that they saw something that was going to happen before it happened. Someone who says, I don't believe in astrology, on the next day will believe in a miracle, right? So we have to be very real, first of all, about the fact that you know, most people in the world, the basic premise of astrology is not unreasonable to them and to the way that they look at reality. It, however, is inconsistent and with and defies much of the status quo or the consensus reality about, you know, the cosmos, about our bodies and our minds, about chemistry and, you know, things like this, right? Science and so forth. So because of that, you know, people sometimes don't know what to do with this you know, section of human experience that is the, let's say, called the spiritual experience. People don't know what to do with it, right? And so I see this, and I'm speaking just from experience of doing this for 10 years and hearing, thousands upon thousands of people come in for readings and say, this is what I believe. I'm open to this. I'm open to that. I'm giving this a try. This is from my observation of people in all different settings that I've gone into and spoken to as a professional astrologer over a decade of my life. So the first thing is that there's nothing really abnormal about astrology. So I think we need that first. We have to realize that this conversation about why do people hate astrology or what do you do about people who hate astrology begins there. There's really nothing that is that abnormal about the spiritual or mystical claims of astrology compared to what most people entertain or believe in on some level, whether it's overt or more concealed on a daily basis all over the planet. To me, this is because spiritual reality it's real. Spiritual reality is reality. So people can't live in denial of something that's real. So you have to cope with it, and a lot of times the way that people do that is to hide or pretend like they don't like something or something is bogus, even though they know that that's not the case. So that's the first thing. And so it's one way that can be helpful of thinking about if you know people, if you're an astrology enthusiast and you know people in your life who deny it, don't take it seriously, mock, chide it, look down upon it, don't believe it, is that most likely they actually do. They may not believe in the validity of astrology itself, but their paradigm is already big enough for astrology, and you will find inconsistencies arising in things they say, do, in the way they act or behave, etc., over time that will betray the fact that they don't really have anything fundamentally against astrology, because the claims of astrology are really the claims of many mystical paths. So that's my first observation. I'd love to hear your guys' observation as we go too. Please, what have your experiences been? Hit the comment section. The thing that we also have to recognize is that to some extent what this means is that the problem isn't really an astrology problem, it's a spiritual problem. It's a problem that people have with just coming out of the spiritual closet. That from the standpoint of the wisdom traditions that I study, Bhakti Yoga, ancient philosophers surrounding the practice of astrology in the East and the West. This is actually an integral part of the process of spiritual awakening. By spiritual awakening, I don't mean anything mystical, really. I just mean the process by means of which someone comes to realize that their limited temporal sense of identity in this body, the ego, which is not an evil, but it is a relative center of focus, and it's not the center of all things. That as someone is awakening to spiritual life, we have to learn how to move the center of focus from the little sense of self that's temporary and transient to the higher sense of self, which is called many different things, but the Atma, but is ultimately the higher self. So as we do this, it's quite natural to freak out because it as everybody knows, I'm preaching to the choir probably, but as you probably all know, there's like an ego death that's involved. The sense of your limited temporary sense of self and the conventions of the ego-based society, the societal norms that are based on upholding the idea that your ego is the center of all things. As they are challenged and as they fall apart, it's very natural for us to just freak out because we're losing what feels like our grip on reality, our control of the narrative, our paradigm, our sense of safety. So we can have compassion because a lot of the times the resistance to astrology is not so much a resistance to astrology as much as it is a resistance to a paradigm that is threatening at the moment to someone. Even if they're naturally interested in that paradigm, they draw near to it and then back away from it. They get they know they take a little taste of it and then scamper backwards. It's natural. In fact, even when you're kind of have had some kind of conversion experience to spiritual life and have, the ego has been appropriately relativized, the process is ongoing because the ego will constantly try to sneak back in and, sit down and make itself the center of everything. And so we're constantly relativizing the ego, helping it to become more of a servant of the soul, of the higher self, a friend to the soul, but not the king. There's a great book. Let's see if I can pick it up here. Great book if you ever want to read a book about the brain and the hemispheres of the brain, and the idea that we even within the anatomy of the hemispheres of the brain, we have a master and a servant, and that the ego tends to come in as the servant, thinking it's the master. This is a really, really great book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain in the Making of the Western World. And it is a book written by if I remember correctly, he is a consultant psychiatrist and clinical director at the Bethlehem Royal and Maudsley Hospital in London. And he's researched in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, taught English at Oxford, etc. But so the idea that we all struggle to the part of us that is naturally supposed to be in service to our higher self, you could say, tends to try to take the reins and become the controller. That's actually something that even medical science is now telling us. So this book was a fantastic, really well-written book about the way in which certain spiritual claims are anatomy and physiology of the brain hemispheres. I just thought it was a great book, so hopefully you'll like it too if you check it out. So the point is that we can have some compassion for people who are afraid of the spiritual reality. Over the years, I've learned to see it that way, that people don't not believe in astrology. They're scared of astrology. They're scared of what the paradigm of astrology, or a lot of different mystical things in general, might do to their sense of self and their grip on what's real. And so we can have compassion for that. We see it that way. It can be a reason to be patient and understanding, and that takes it. It takes the stress off from us, because we also don't have to feel like someone else's dislike of astrology or someone else's rejection of astrology is about us. So ultimately, it's not about us. It's about their own denial of having a higher self, of being a higher self. It's the ego's fear that if it goes into a submissive position in service to a higher reality and a higher self, that it will lose control, be unsafe, be abandoned, be attacked, something. So that's my experience of this over time. And I see it in myself as well in the opposite direction. It's so when we could say the one point that I wrote down is, it's not about you, it's about them. But the counterpoint to that is, but it could be about you. And let me explain that. So this was all spurred by the fact that someone recently in my life basically kind of came out with a statement that revealed how little they think of astrology, which of course was hard not to take personally, because sometimes I feel like I am astrology. I walk, live, breathe astrology every day. This is my life. This is my spiritual practice, right? So, but notice how behind that is the possessive, my spiritual practice, my astrology, my birth chart, blah, blah, blah. So similarly, the thing that's difficult when you really love something, whether it's a spiritual practice, religion, a spiritual tool, or anything, is to become, once again, the ego will try to identify itself. Well, I am astrology. I am, the validity of astrology is the validity of me. But we have to go beyond this, because it's also possible that it actually really is about us. People can sense that we've built our ego upon something, you know. It's also not off limits to build an ego, right? Let's just say that. Like, it's not a sin to have an ego, to have a sense of self. But when people notice that we are like overly identified with astrology, and how are some of the ways you can notice? Because you're always evangelizing about it, always talking about it. And I'm not talking about people like myself or other professional astrologers who do it for a living in front of an audience that's interested in astrology. I'm talking about the fanaticism of when I first started, for example, where like I was reading the charts of every single person I knew. You know what I mean? Like unsolicited astrological advice, thinking, etc. So, and also just the fact that we can also treat astrology like it gives us a high horse to sit on. Oh, well, you know, astrology, because astrology is a part of this higher reality, I'm so great. You know what I mean? And that's a sneaky thing, because, you know, it's one thing to have compassion for people because maybe they are afraid of losing their grip on reality and all of the stuff that we were just describing. It's another thing entirely to, you know, have that weaponized compassion, you know, like, oh, you poor lost thing. You know what I mean? Oh, you're so unenlightened, but I'm so patient for you. You know, like that. That's crappy. So if it's hard to spot that that's what we're doing. So like I had to catch myself yesterday after this exchange, because one of my reactions was defensive. This was not yesterday actually, but I had to, after this conversation, before I made the video yesterday, one of the things that I was thinking about was I have to be careful that my response is not defensive, because when my response is defensive, it's an indicator for me that rather than me just taking this higher reality as a matter of fact, this is just the way that it is, we live in a mystical spiritual reality, I become someone that's identified with it in an oppositional manner. In other words, and if you think it's not true, then you think that there's something wrong with me, right? So, you know, my defensive reaction was to feel like, oh, this person is bashing astrology a little bit. They're kind of coming out with it. And that must mean that they don't take me seriously. It must mean that they don't like me. It must mean that they think that I'm a charlatan, or something like that. You know what I mean? Now, part of this is just feeling hurt because I'm an astrologer and I do this for a living. And so sometimes when people say crappy things, it's just like, it's natural to feel sort of hurt. But on the other hand, it gave me room to pause and to say, to what extent am I overly concerned with people validating me and astrology simultaneously? So we have to be careful of that, because sometimes it's them, not us. Sometimes it is us and not them. Sometimes the way that we hold astrology it feeds into a superiority complex. And it's subtle, and it's not black or white. One day it can feed into a superiority complex, and the next day you may be in service to your clients, in service to astrology. Astrology is a spiritual practice. Astrology is not something that you are doing to try to gain power or dominion over others. So we're imperfect beings. Sometimes we will weaponize astrology, and then our compassion for people who don't understand the higher reality implied by astrology is weaponized. So we have to be very, very careful of that. And it really comes down to, in my experience, having the time to really sort of check in with ourselves and like, where am I? When I encounter someone who has animosity toward astrology, where am I? And how do I feel? What am I feeling? There is no, and one mantra that really helps me is, there is no need to defend a reality. There is no need to defend a reality that is real. Do you see what I'm saying? There's no need to defend something that just is. Astrology just is. The reality that astrology depicts is real. It doesn't need my defending. It doesn't need my advocacy. It doesn't need my proof. It doesn't need my defense. It doesn't even need me. That's a position that we can get in that's humble. And when I say me, of course, I mean it doesn't need my ego. My ego, in fact, will die someday. It's just as transient as, the clouds in the sky that come and disappear. So it doesn't need me, but I do need it. I have taken shelter of this language. It has given me spiritual comfort, spiritual home, spiritual center, spiritual guidance. So I've taken shelter of it, and I am its humble servant, and it does not need defending because it is great and true and real and beautiful and just and good. So when I can kind of come back into that position, I know that I'll cut my ego off at the pass of taking things too personally when you encounter people in your life that really have resistance to astrology. So let's see. It's threatening to people's ego, to people's reality, but that doesn't mean that they don't actually believe in it or aren't interested in it. That doesn't mean that there aren't inconsistencies. It's not about you, it's about them, but it could be about you. Those are my first 3 points. Fourth point I want to make is that there's no need to convince everyone of astrology, sort of what I just said, but I want to take it a step further. Not only do we not need to defend the reality, the reality of spirit, the reality of soul, the reality of the stars and planets, but the thing is that if I look at how astrology opened me up, how astrology found its way into my life, what I realize is that its way of entering my life was natural, organic, and no one convinced me of it. No one knocked down my door and said, hey, you should really believe in this. No one said, you're thinking about reality in the wrong way, and let me tell you about astrology. Astrology helped me reconfigure my understanding of reality, myself, the soul, etc. But it was my gradual interest in the reality of spiritual life that opened up the door for astrology to come in and start speaking to me. That came from within me. It came from within my heart, my own volition, my own free will. So if we want to see people enlightened, the thing that we need to do, and I know that not everyone's going to like hearing this, but in my opinion, the thing that we need to do is to pray for people. And I don't mean that in an intellectual sense, like just some kind of passive aggressive thought that we hope that they get unsick someday. No, I really mean that if we see that people have an interest in spirit, but that they're deeply conflicted about it, that when we see that person in our life, that we take some time and literally just go within and anoint them with good energy. Just be like, I hope that that part of you that's interested in this finds a natural, safe, exciting way to come into that interest that is within you. Or I hope that you have an experience that helps you move through your doubts. We don't say that to someone to their face, like condescendingly. And you don't condescend in your heart either. You genuinely wish that for someone, genuinely. And when we meet people in our life that are like, they accost us, it's the second thing is not only do we not have to convince them, do we not have to defend anything, but actually we can remember that most of the time for us, it was not someone, on a soapbox telling us why we were so wrong and why we should believe in astrology. It was something natural in us that was opened up and that found astrology. That's how it happens. And we don't really have a lot to do with that other than being humble emissaries of what astrology is, giving people an example of what they see. People who are doing astrology, who are good people, who are thoughtful, who are self-reflective, who are meditative, who are peaceful, who are interesting, but who do not push anything, that is the most convincing thing. And similarly, our prayers for the people that come across our path, in earnest, sincere prayers that say, may you move through this doubt in a good way, however you may, this lifetime or in 10 lifetimes from now. May you find a natural, inspiring connection to spirit. that's unique to you. Pray that in our hearts. It gladdens us, and we don't, not only do we not feel like we have to defend anything, but we don't any longer feel threatened, and we don't feel like we have to get into it with people. That's really hard. I don't always succeed at that. Sometimes I become, the evangelist when I receive resistance. Well, here's why you're wrong, or like, you're not really thinking about it right, or something like that. Or don't you know how great astrology, haven't you seen it in evidence in your life? Like, look at this. Or, like I've tried with certain family members before to say, look at how this played out in your life. How can you tell me that this isn't real? Stuff like that doesn't work. It's not helpful. You can't use reason to talk someone out of a position that they did not use reason to get into. It's just a simple thing. No need to try to prove astrology. Plato, in the allegory of the cave, said that when people are waking up from the shadow dance on the wall of the cave, that, and I consider myself and probably most of us are still quite enamored with it on a regular basis, right? Not like we're above it. But that as we are disengaging from the reality of the shadows on the wall, that we also, there is a natural desire to share it with other people. The prisoner who's released from his bonds, when he sees his fellow people suffering, there's the natural compassionate desire to free others. Hey, come on, check this out. You don't have to be in chains. Those shadows aren't the real thing. There's this fire over here. There's the light of the sun outside of the cave. Come on. That's a good instinct. It's a good impulse. So the other thing we have to balance out is that a life where there is no evangelism in spirituality is not a real spirituality, because the natural impulse of receiving freedom and love is to give it and to share it, because that's what love is. It's freely given, and it flows forward and wants to continue to be freely shared. So it's also natural to want to try to give astrology to other people. What we need to develop usually is a sense of how to share it, where to share it, when it's appropriate to share it. Drawing boundaries. This is where I do astrology, and over here is maybe where I'm just a normal person who doesn't necessarily think about astrology all the time, or do astrology all the time, or need to bring it with me wherever I go. Sometimes when we're young astrologers, especially, I've noticed when people are young astrologers, there's nothing wrong with this, but our reality is so astrological that we feel like we need to think about and refer to every single thing that's happening in our lives astrologically and then share it with everyone. And I studied memoir writing in my MFA. I love sharing personal stories and how I see the astrology working. The point at which this becomes damaging potentially is the point at which we can't recognize time, place, and circumstance when that's appropriate to share and when it isn't. Or when we need to also give people signs that we understand and still have a foot in consensus reality. So the evangelistic spirit of wanting to share that which liberates and frees and that which is loving is natural. We can't get rid of that. We shouldn't get rid of that. People who believe that all spiritual evangelism is inherently evil and you should never try to convince people of anything that's good for them are cynical. On the other hand, time, place, and circumstance of where to share, how to share, and making sure that people know that you still are in with them, that your spiritual life is not something that triggers the fear of abandonment, that you're with them, that you see reality that the same way that they do too. That's really important. So time, place, and circumstance for being in the astrological glasses, having them on and knowing when to take them off and just, sort of participate in the status quo a bit. We have this black and white idea that once you've seen astrology, it's like you can never go back. Well, that's just not true, because much of our life we walk around, living like I go to Target to get something and I'm not walking through the aisles being like, whoa, like Uranus and you know what I mean? It's not, but sometimes what I've noticed is that that's the culture of astrology, is that have you drank the Kool-Aid? Because once you do, then you'll just see everything through. Yeah, there's a way in which everything becomes astrological, but if we want to build a bridge for people to cross over, that bridge has to be one that works with gradations of spirit and matter. You know what I mean? And so if we become enemies of the status quo and pair that up with the evangelistic spirit, it also turns people off. So we have to have some degree of relatableness. And also, along with this comes this idea of the long game. The long game theory for people dealing with haters of astrology works like this. They may not believe it now, but if you just keep loving the people that you love without judgment, and you might have to suffer some some abuse along the way of people who think that what you do or what you're interested in is crap. More than likely, because people are all spiritual beings living in a spiritual cosmos where the planets are indeed real, and the planetary paradigm of astrology is indeed real, that if you keep doing your thing and not worrying about what other people think, that those who are close to you, that you are, it's hardest to have in opposition to your interest in astrology, will start opening up or naturally taking more of an interest. There will come a time where there is an opening. May not be for years, but it comes. And I know this is true also with astrology clients. I have clients that sometimes come in for a reading. They get the reading and they say, I don't know about this. I don't know if I believe in any of this. A couple of years later, some of the predictions, hit home and they go, oh my God, you know what I mean? If I judged that situation of the reading for what it was without the long game in my mind, I would think that they really didn't like it, or that I had done something wrong, or that astrology wasn't working, or, oftentimes you have to play the long game. So that's really important. So that's the first part. A few more points. The long game. Praying for our enemies is a practice, not a nice idea. So sometimes you're going to meet people who aren't just like skeptical or think that what you're doing is silly, but it's sort of lighthearted, and it might hurt your feelings, but it's not worth getting into a blowout over. Like, a lot of the times that's more normal. Sometimes you're going to have people who are very actively and aggressively mean to you. They say that what you do is crap. They say, how could you ever use astrology to make such important decisions? Or why would you, I can't believe that you would talk to an astrologer about something like that. I can't believe that you would trust the validity of astrology, something, and how stupid are you, or whatever. And when you're dealing with people who are like this, in my experience, it's almost never a good idea to get into it with someone. Again, you're not going to talk someone out of a position using reason that they didn't use reason to get into in the first place. People who don't believe in astrology, I know this is going to sound really kind of like an intense statement, but people who have a grudge against astrology, one of two things is true. One is that they have no experience of astrology, and yet they're making a judgment of it, which is irrational. Two, they have experience of astrology, and if they've had any real experience of astrology and they're still judging it to be false, then they're also being irrational. The third might be that they have had an experience of astrology that was unfortunately a very poor or bad representation of astrology, and that's sort of understandable. Right? But most of the time, not so much. Most of the time, it's people who have had no experience making a judgment, which is ironically irrational. And what they'll say is that astrology is irrational. Or it's people who have had an experience of astrology, who've actually seen it demonstrated, but still say, well, that's irrational, or that's bad, or that's dumb, or something like that. That position is also irrational. So in that case, it doesn't help to try to use reason to talk a person out of the experience. It doesn't help to try to prove astrology. Sometimes people will be like, well, let me just prove it to you. We have to remember that this is an oracle that we're dealing with. And oracles do not respond well to disrespectful people or to people who are coming without faith or who are coming for ill motives or for ego or to prove something. Oracles will not speak. You can use the tarot cards and flip cards over. It does not mean that it will work. when tarot works, just like when astrology works, part of the reason that it works is not just because it's some objectively true science. It is because the spirit of the heavens, the planets, the gods, your cultivation of a consciousness, the consciousness of a diviner, has facilitated that the relationship such that the symbols and omens will speak. That doesn't happen most of the time when we test the oracle because we're dealing with someone that we'd like to prove wrong. As much as we would love to, it does not. And we should think about why it doesn't at a very deep level. Because we're not trying to beat people into submission about astrology. We're not trying to win people to astrology. The reality that astrology implies is bigger than reality, is bigger than astrology itself. And the reality that astrology implies is something that people have to start coming to on their own before astrology makes sense as a part of that spiritual process. So it doesn't work. But praying for our enemies can work. And this is similar to praying for people to have a nice experience, an opening experience. The other thing that we can do is just make a practice of praying for those that persecute astrology. I know it sounds weird because it's like, it's an idea that we all appreciate, like pray for your enemies, something that Jesus taught. But it's a practical thing. It's not just an idea. It's something that we have to do day in and day out. I get trolls on YouTube. I get trolls on Facebook, people who want to challenge, right? And provoke or discourage or insult or injure or harm. And so I've developed a little bit of a thick skin, but I'm still sensitive, So I have my ways of dealing with these kinds of things personally. But the best way of dealing with them is to go into your heart and authentically muster care, concern, and goodwill for them. It's not, you don't have to say, oh, I hope that their stupid ass gets enlightened. God help them, like how can, like if you have to, it's a practice to really get into the heart and really care about the people that you're pissed off at. And it doesn't mean that just because you do that, that the result is going to change either. But that practice is important because it starts cultivating within us more of the presence spiritually that attracts people to not just astrology, but to the reality that astrology implies, which is spiritual life. Setting boundaries is important. I'm going to say this one, a couple more points, then I'm done for today. Setting boundaries is important. If you are constantly in situations with people who don't like astrology or who are hard on astrology and you feel like you're hiding yourself, you might need better situation. You might need a better environment. If your life is not set up to have to be in safe spaces enough with astrology so that you can just be yourself with it, your life might not be set up quite right. Maybe there's not a lot you can do about it. That might be your karma or my karma to be in certain situations where, we're just going to have to bear with it. It's also not a bad idea to configure our lives around community, people, friendships, and environments that are conducive to the things that we love and do spiritually, including astrology. So sometimes we have to take inventory and be really careful. In Bhakti Yoga, we say that, for example, my spiritual teacher, he always uses this example, walking through San Francisco, the storm drains say, no dumping drains to the bay, meaning don't dump crap down here because this is all draining down into the bay. Well, he says, actually, the yogic shastras, the scriptures tell us the same thing, but they say it's the ears and the eyes. Don't dump crap in here because it drains into the bay of the heart. So similarly, when we put ourselves in situations with people who don't listen to us, who don't see us, who don't appreciate us, who don't respect us, as people who have interests in investments in whatever we are interested in, whether it's astrology or yoga or anything else, if we keep putting ourselves in environments like that, it's toxic. And so we have to draw boundaries and say, nope, I can't be around this person or these people that much more because there's not spiritual respect there. And that's a hard thing to do because sometimes it can feel like we're judging other people, or that we're acting high and mighty. But we can do this boundary setting without resorting to self-righteousness. There's a way of setting boundaries that, is healthy. And sometimes we need to do that. Spiritual life needs a tight lid in order for the inner alchemy to process. This is why people in most places in the world, the more serious they get about spiritual life, the more that their living becomes like an ashram. It becomes more about a current that circulates and maintaining that like a sweet hearth fire. And influences that come in become increasingly sensitive the more that your spiritual practice progresses. And that's the same thing for astrology, if astrology is part of a spiritual practice. If it is joined in your life with spiritual intentions, then you have to be careful to keep a lid on the environment. It can't be too tight, because one of the beauties of alchemy is that, just the right kinds of foreign elements kind of coming in, from different places, some diversity, flavor needs to come in as well. And we make soul out of that. That's a part, so we need the influence. We're not to be renunciates, hold away, in my opinion, in a cave somewhere with a super tight lid on, So somewhere between having too tight of a lid and no lid at all, we have to be really careful, because if we have too many people who are really intensely opposed to astrology in our lives, no degree of patience, compassion, praying for your enemies, etc., will do it. There's just too much toxicity being dumped into the bay of the heart. Finally, being self-reflective about our own karma is very important. Whenever we get into a situation where we feel overwhelmed by adversity, people who oppose what we do, think, believe, the way we pray, whatever the case might be, and they're on a mission to make it known that they disagree, or they try to subvert what we're doing, or they're constantly trying to shift and guide us away from spiritual life or spiritual commitments because they think it's zany or weird or whatever. The more that people do this, one of the things that I've taken time to do is to say, how did I come into this environment? And I start noticing that there are many patterns in my life that coalesce into maybe a larger pattern of being around people who are actively trying to distract, dissuade, harm, interfere with, or conflict with my spiritual intentions. And so, that's something, you probably all dealt with this too. One of the first things that we can do is just be reflective. How did I get myself into this situation? I'll give you an example. I like to travel, but I've also noticed that if I travel to see family who I love, but if I travel to see family and the stay is too long, it's like going to the grocery store on an empty stomach. You get there and you're like, and you just buy too much. The idea of going to see family sometimes, for example, sounds great, and so then I go to the grocery store hungry. I plan for 2 weeks or something like that, when maybe a week would be better, or 10 days, or even a weekend or something like that, So, and that's not like all family members feel that way about one another, I think, even regardless of spirituality, right? So sometimes, like, you'll notice that you put yourself into positions expecting more than is there. And so you can just say, there's a way in which I've put myself into a position where I'm overwhelming myself. It's like an introvert who tries really hard to be extroverted, and they end up overwhelming themselves and getting sick because they can't just accept that they're an introvert. So sometimes, being really aware of how and why we are creating the situations that we're creating that are putting us in the company of people who are not supportive, don't see us, don't care, or are directly, aggressive toward us about astrology. Being self-reflective, being like, how does my own karma put me in this situation, without beating ourselves up, of course, but just being kind of real. That can really, really help. Last point I want to reemphasize one more time is that on a daily basis, there are more people on this planet who believe in spiritual things, signs and omens and dreams, synchronicities, They'll read the meaning of a random thing that they find. They'll open to a random page, read a fortune cookie, open a horoscope. People flirt all the time with the reality of spirit because spirit is real. And so, you know, most people aren't astrology haters. They're astrology confused. And being in the astrological closet is not a bad place to be, because in some ways we all start there, just like we're all, we're all prisoners in the cave to a certain extent. So this is a natural part of astrology for thousands of years. Astrologers themselves have written about this. For that reason, they have given astrologers almost unanimously the same advice over many, many, many centuries, which is to be honest, to be an example of virtue for everyone, so that no one can basically blame astrology for turning them away from spiritual matters. Be easy of access to people. Be open about astrology, but don't be so open that you overwhelm people. So somewhere again between the trying to share the light, so to speak, and making sure that we don't push too hard and freak people out. I hope this was useful for everybody. I just wrote down a list of some of the main thoughts that I have about how to deal with people that hate on astrology. Maybe the simplest piece of advice is stay away from online conversations and debates about astrology, because it really doesn't accomplish anything. You know what I mean? Like, that's the worst place to get into it, is the internet, where you in the chat boxes and forums and stuff where you debate with people, or you go to some website and someone's ripping on astrology and you spend a day trying to convince them otherwise or something. Don't do that stuff. That's really, my experience, is a real waste of time. So that's what I've got for you guys. I'm going to end here. Thank you guys for listening. Remember, we are at, check again. Are we at $3.99 still? $3.99. We're still at $3.99 backers towards 420. You're going to be the 400th backer. So I appreciate it. Thank you guys. We'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye.